Friends, Romans, countrymen, hello and welcome to Group 4's final video essay on othering. As we have pondered, contemplated, and thought about the philosophical and economic state of the world, we have come to the revolutionary conclusion that the process of othering is bad. And unfortunately, we see it in every aspect of our lives. Even just the slightest bit of difference will put you in the category of the other. And it's through Shakespeare's plays that we've been able to confront this idea head on. But as our group has narrowed down on this idea, we wanted to see how othering shapes one's perception and contemporarily confronts this problem. So, as our group has ruminated on the final boss of othering in Shakespeare, we have come to the following conclusion in our headline statement. Casting in Shakespeare's plays functions as a deliberate act of identity construction that confronts contemporary forms of othering.
By placing marginalized identity at the center through intentional casting choices, productions expose and challenge ongoing social exclusions related to race, gender, and sexuality.
Through Titus Andronicus, Much Ado About Nothing, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, these productions reveal how Shakespeare can be reclaimed as a space for 21st century conversations and belonging, power, and representation.
I'm going to be talking about casting as a design element. In many modern plays, casting has become a deliberate design choice, just as intentional and impactful as lighting, costume, or set. The identity of an actor, their race, gender, and voice begins to shape the meaning of the moment they step on stage, long before any words are spoken. And in a play like Shakespeare's, where the text is more or less fixed, these casting choices can dramatically reshape how a story is experienced, especially in how it reflects or challenges our cultural assumptions about power, identity, and who belongs at the center of the narrative. Theater is a visual medium, as much as it is a verbal one. A character's meaning is never just the script, it's how that script is embodied. When a character like Hamlet or Julius Caesar is played by a woman, or when Macbeth is cast as a black actor, the effect isn't just symbolic. It alters how audiences perceive the character and the relationships around them. These kinds of casting decisions can bring out nuances in Shakespeare's work that may otherwise have gone unnoticed. And they allow directors to explore power dynamics in ways they feel are newly relevant. Shakespeare's plays endure not just because of their language, but because in ways they're adaptable, and casting plays a big part in that adaptivity and flexibility. Casting becomes especially charged when it intersects with social structures like race and gender. Who plays a role can subtly, or not so subtly, reveal who society tends to see as noble, authoritative, the insider, or dangerous, outsider, the other. Today's productions often lean into this, using casting to hold a mirror to our assumptions. When a white male actor plays a king, they tend to pass without comment. But when a black woman takes on the same role, it forces the audiences to look again, even reconsider what power looks like and who is typically in that role. It forces the audiences to rethink that role and how it affects the play. This turns casting into something more than a practical choice. It becomes a kind of visual argument about status and identity. A good example of this can be seen in Titus Andronicus. In this play, the Goths are mostly cast as people of color, while Romans are played by white actors. This choice doesn't change a single word of the play, but entirely reframes it. Suddenly, Titus becomes not just a revenge tragedy, it's a commentary on race, nationalism, and exclusionism. When audiences see actors of color cast as the Goths and the outsiders, it brings up real-world parallels: immigrants, refugees, communities that have been historically treated as outsiders or others. The play starts to echo modern fears about border control, belonging, and who gets to claim the moral high ground. The Romans, often seen as heroes, start to look like agents of empire and oppression. And Goths, who once might have seemed barbaric and less than human, become humanized, people with families, values, and legitimate grievances. The casting doesn't just flip the roles, it asks the audience to question why they ever saw one group as more civilized than the other. This kind of casting also muddies the moral waters in a productive way. When characters coded as powerful and civilized commit horrific acts, it forces the audiences to reconcile with that contradiction. And when those casts as outsiders show compassion or strength, it redefines what kind of behavior we associate with certain identities. creates a more complex and more truthful version of the world, one where people are not easily sorted into categories of good and evil based on their identity. That complexity is what makes Shakespeare's work feel alive, and casting brings it to the surface. These choices also make Shakespeare feel more immediate and connected to our time. They provide a way that Shakespeare's works, while over 400 years old, can still apply in modern society. The presence of actors on stage, their lived experiences, their visible identities, make social structures span timelines. Casting is an impactful design element in many productions, and as we saw in Titus, it can entirely change the narrative of how that play is perceived and what the message that it is trying to send is. Casting is just as impactful as other design elements, and is one that can be viewed differently from all angles, as well as reflecting on modern society and how we view others and othering.
Casting decisions in theater today are no longer about just fitting into a role. They're about challenging the audience's expectations. From all women productions and queer interpretations to people of color, these choices intentionally disrupt what many consider traditional or authentic Shakespeare. But what is authenticity in performance, and who gets to define it? When directors cast against the grain, whether by race, gender, or sexuality, they ask us to examine not just the play, but ourselves. These decisions bring long-standing biases to the surface, especially in classical text, often rooted in Eurocentric norms. It brings new meaning, inviting marginalized identities into a space from which they've long been excluded. This is where the distinction between colorblind and color-conscious casting matters. Colorblind casting ignores race entirely, aiming for equality by pretending difference doesn't exist. But color-conscious casting embraces it and asks, what does it mean if this character is Black, Asian, Indigenous, or Hispanic? And in this context, it could mean a whole different thing. But how does this change the dynamic? What conversation does it open up? Well, let's look at Much Ado About Nothing, a play built on romance, deception, and social status. When Claudio and Beatrice, the central romantic leads, are cast as people of color, it challenges century-old narratives about who is seen as desirable, pure, or worthy of love. Historically, people of color have often been pushed to the sidelines or reduced to harmful stereotypes in media. Casting them as romantic leads doesn't just change what we see, it changes what we assume. It forces us to confront the biases we've absorbed, especially those shaped by the media and online, especially the views of race, gender, and love. This choice puts our discomfort in the spotlight. Even today, interracial or non-white couples are often met with unspoken judgment or made to feel different, but placing them front and center on the stage only amplifies those reactions. But what's powerful is that by the end, the conversation shifts. By the end of the performance, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the performance. We stop talking about how different the casting was and start talking about the story, the acting, how it made us feel. In that way, casting forces a reckoning and then makes itself invisible. That's the beauty of it. It pushes boundaries, challenges assumptions, and ultimately normalizes what should have been accepted all along. This kind of representation does not just reframe the play, it directly impacts the audience, especially the younger and more diverse viewers. Seeing yourself reflected in a Shakespeare role that is complex, desirable, intelligent, and flawed is powerful. It tells you that your story matters. It tells you that you belong in these cultural narratives, not just as a background or comic relief, but as the lead. It also helps dismantle the idea that Shakespeare is not only for the elite or the white or the historically privileged. Instead, these plays are living, breathing stories meant to evolve with society. The more inclusive they become, the more relevant they feel. Casting decisions like those in Much Ado About Nothing aren't just artistic, they're political. They force audiences to confront with the deep-seated ideas about race, gender, identity. They ask us who gets to be loved, who gets to be tragic, who gets to be heard. When we move beyond the idea of traditional casting, We open up Shakespeare to a world as it is, not just as the world it was in. And in doing so, we create a space for everyone to find themselves in these stories.
While my groupmates have explored the vital role of representation in Shakespearean casting, I want to expand on this idea to discuss how these casting choices are also made to reclaim narratives of marginalized voices. Let's look at the Bridges production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. This production significantly adapted the play to switch around traditional gender roles, directly inviting a queer narrative. In this production, it queer casted many of its characters. In comparison to when you are simply reading Shakespeare, what may be subtle subtext is then taken to be a deliberate and proud choice to modernize for today's audiences. Think about the production's choice to swap around the roles of Titania and Oberon. If we were to look at casting as a design element, by having Oberon take on Titania's traditional role, the dynamic between Oberon and Bottom, #Boberon, for instance, immediately takes on a new queer dimension. In contrast to queer-coded Shakespeare, like Mercutio from Romeo and Juliet, Antonio from The Merchant of Venice, or the entirety of Twelfth Night, this version of Midsummer takes this code and translates it vividly in your face. This translation then allows audiences who are part of that community to see themselves represented on stage and connect with the stories and begin to reclaim and interpret them as their own. These casting choices explicitly signal to the audience that this is a contemporary production, and more importantly, Shakespeare can and should be adapted for contemporary times. Because at the end of the day, these aren't just simple casting choices. They inherently introduce a broader lens of what is considered normal. According to scholar Lance Garvey at Arizona State University, stories aren't just entertainment. They are fundamental to how we understand ourselves in the world. They define our social reality and interactions with one another, or the other. Recognizing this influence means acknowledging this moral responsibility that storytelling has. So whether it is casting goths as people of color, being race conscious on the casting of main romantic leads, or casting with the intention of Bottom living up to his name, in more ways than one, all of these choices play a role in the narrative machine that works to shape the status quo as we know it. These casting choices are an act of cultural reclamation or reappropriation, as defined by the Sustainability Directory as the act of restoring and revitalizing cultural practices, traditions, and knowledge systems. This concept emphasizes agency and self-determination to allow these movements to be led by the communities themselves. They are essentially reclaiming to define and celebrate their cultural identities on their own terms. A Midsummer Night's Dream, with its eccentric stage design, vivid colors, and fiery music, can be interpreted as a celebration of queer identity. I mean, let's look at the director himself. Nicholas Heitner is a gay man. Given this context, it can be inferred that the casting and directional choices of Midsummer were informed by the director's background. In short, there is no straight explanation for that play. And side note, Shakespeare, people have their own speculations. These modern adaptations of Shakespeare that we have seen on this trip have helped us further understand why it is especially important to continue to interpret and shift these dynamics within classical narratives. This is to not only allow the overarching and timeless messages of these stories to evolve alongside our society, but also to challenge the stereotypical, heteronormative, patriarchal, and racist narratives that have long informed and shaped our perspectives in the past. Also, these plays are not easy to put on. They take months and maybe even years of deliberation and collective effort. So when the RSC, the Globe, or even West End choose to cast these actors, they knew that Titania would take on what is a traditionally masculine role. They knew that the Athenian lovers' love triangle would instead be a rectangle. They knew that Puck and the fairies would have to look and act a certain way. One can still argue that these choices could have been coincidental, because yes, nothing says straight like rainbow strobe lights. We also have to realize that nothing in theater is coincidental. Every choice that these creative teams make are put there to serve a purpose. Theater is put on to teach and spread messages. You can't just look at a theater production and assume, oh yeah, this is so fun, I'm just gonna leave the theater and not think about what I just watched. When gender and identity are at the forefront of political discussion today, it is impossible to not look at theater or even art in general without thinking that they were created, directed, and produced with modern political and social ideas in mind. And no matter where you are or where you're from, we take these stories and reframe it to our own personal experiences. After all, we exist in the context.
Hello, Peter and Lee. I realize now that you may not have gotten entirely what that meant. So here's the meme.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
And now you know.
For me, I saw Midsummer as a celebration of queer art and media as a way to directly combat the attack on the community today. In light of hate, you fire back stronger with joy. And from our perspective as Americans, with our current administration speaking fervently of anti-trans rhetoric, taking actions to restrict access to gender-affirming care, and even removing the LGBTQ+ suicide hotline, theater has and always will be political. Maybe Shakespeare wasn't thinking about how centuries later students would be interpreting how his plays would be applied to social issues in 2025, but these issues just don't come out of nowhere. Art and theater respond to the world in the best way they know. They share our stories, heartbreak, and happiness. And for marginalized groups, to be the ones on that platform, to hold up the mirror to the world, the other takes their title and reclaims it as their own.
Prior to this trip, I did not think of Shakespeare as deeply as I do now. I mean, there was high school, but this was completely different from that. To be able to actually go in person and see these plays, discover the history and circumstances in which they were written, and seeing the ripple effect of it all was a completely different story. To realize that even the smallest choices, like casting, can make all the difference in how we view the world is crazy. Yeah, Shakespeare was like one of the greats, but as we continue to evolve and adapt as humans, our power to challenge and shape the narrative becomes uniquely ours, and then it becomes up to us to be or not to be. That is the question. Thanks for watching.